Hello, and welcome to the Coachlogik podcast. I'm your host, Max Ada, and I'm joined by, well, this guy, Josh Gibson. Josh, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. I just had a great Americano in this weightlifting.ai mug.
Our title sponsor. This is the Coachlogik podcast brought to you by weightlifting.ai, the greatest training app you can have for weightlifting.
Yeah, I'm sold. and you can try it 2 weeks free with
2 week
code
free trial.
2 week trial.
Yeah. So interesting, I guess we're talking about in Coachlogik mentorship group, we've talked about hypertrophy training.
Yeah.
We've talked about some other topics, peaking. The question now would be let's talk a little more broadly today about general training.
Sure.
So the normal structure, let's say the typical structure for a training program is going to be going from general extensive training to specific intensive training.
Yep.
So we would move from high volume, really basic stuff. Early in the cycle might be like learning how to move and general physical preparation, getting into shape to be able to train hard. Within that general phase of training, we know that things like hypertrophy training is going to be embedded within that. Now, from the perspective of a weightlifting program, general training phase, what would you describe as being sort of the key defining elements of a general phase of training? And to what degree is that important in the preparation of a weightlifter?
Sure. So broadly, we have to think about intensities, volumes, and exercise selection. Mm-hmm. So I think the three bedrock variables of training. And a lot of the reasons why a block or a period of training is structured the way it is to take advantage of what you need and how you can achieve it.
Yeah.
Right. So if we want to put on muscular size, we want to put on body weight. If we want to improve capacity to tolerate training, if we want to develop movement competence, if we have these broader outcomes that feed into or sequence into more specific outcomes, we think about how we optimize for that. Optimizing for the things I just listed, like capacity and size and skill, would be we got to do something that's a little bit more work. Mm-hmm. So we have to think about the size of the workload. And then we have to think about, okay, if we need to do more work, we probably have to scale back on the percentages a bit. We're probably going to want to increase exercise variety. We're probably going to want to shift away from purely competitive exercises because they tend to stress the organism in a way that's not optimizing for any particular outcome except for performance of the movement. Mm-hmm. So we scale back a lot and we think about doing more work in more exercises at more medium low to medium intensities. So I'd say 60 to 80%, 65 to 85%. That's the bulk of the work. And that's going to be constructed in a way where there's probably going to be a growth in workload done across time because you're coming off of basically a period of detraining. It's what a peaking block is or a taper is. Right. It's a structured period of detraining. You might go into an active rest block where you're trying to bridge a low volume program with a higher volume program. So it's going to be more medium volume, lower intensity. So you kind of ramp up. You see the highest volumes, the most variety, and then you're probably going to see the lowest frequency in competitive movements.
Yeah.
So everything's going to look as diametrically opposed to a peaking block as possible within a macro cycle.
So let's touch on a couple of those points. We know that our general period of training is to facilitate adaptations that are foundational to further periods of training, right? Muscle hypertrophy being one of those goals is not necessarily a specific adaptation that would improve your snatch.
Yep.
Stronger muscles are, maybe you could say generally stronger muscles are not necessarily specific either, but the ability to display force in the snatch is specific. Yep. The foundational elements that lead to that are stronger muscles, which are, generally going to be bigger muscles, right? So going back to this general phase of training, we're doing these training, methods, or employing training methods that are driving adaptations that are not hyper specific or particularly specific, but they are foundational to the next phases. To what degree do you think, or do we think, that it would make sense to remove that degree of specificity as far as maintaining a high degree of technical skill in the snatch and clean and jerk, the ability to tolerate high intensity loads that are large? So like, how far removed can a general phase be, or do you feel a general phase can be, before we start to have detrimental impacts on the sport that would be almost like you'd be going so far back that you're now stumbling over yourself to get back to the shape you need to be in?
And that's the thing, right? Is like how strongly do the competitive techniques like stick around? Like
Right.
how much do they degrade, basically? And I would say like the closer you are to your actual peak, like peak as an athlete forever, probably the more specific the training should be. I don't think you'd want to get away from it quite as much, because it's going to take you such a long time to ramp back into peak shape. Whereas someone who does CrossFit, maybe they do snatch, clean, and jerk once a week, maybe they do it once a month, then they have a max out and they hit a PR.
Yeah.
So they don't have to do a ton of highly specific training. They also don't have to do a ton of specific varied training.
Yeah.
So, they could do, we're doing dumbbell presses, and it's like, oh, my overhead in the snatch feels better. Whereas someone else might have to do, press from squat.
Right.
They might have to do press from split. They might have to do a bunch of more specific developmental exercises that then aid in improving their ability to snatch and clean and jerk more. So I would say, like, the more advanced you are, the more skilled you are, the more sensitive all of that stuff is going to be to time off. So like, it won't decay quite as much, because someone who snatches 200 kilos always going to snatch more than almost everyone else. But like their ability to snatch 200 kilos is going to be a lot harder to maintain.
Right.
It's going to be a lot more work.
Right.
Whereas if you snatch 100 kilos, like, I can take time off, and getting back to a 100 kilo snatch is a snap of my fingers.
2 or 3 weeks or something.
Yeah, it's very quick. So I could probably get further away and get back to shape faster. People who are very, very skilled aren't going to be able to have that same benefit.
The dichotomy there, though, is that the greater your results, the more significant time needs to be spent developing a certain quality.
That's right.
But the other caveat to that, the sort of back and forth, is that the bigger your results, the more likely you've already maximized these general qualities.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and the more
Lasha's probably not going to build more muscle.
Yeah.
He's as big as he's going to get.
Yeah. And the more work he's done, so the more work he can tolerate. So if you have, 9 sessions, that's different allocating work to 9 sessions than it is allocating work to 3 sessions.
Right.
So having, 9 and having 3 be somewhat specific is very different from having 3 and not being able to make any of them specific, or just having one specific session.
Yeah.
So the training looks a lot different based on your body of work you did previously. Yep. For most people, when you write a general block of training, what's your thought process? Because I think a lot of people wonder, where do I start? And then once they start, they can kind of find their way, but like finding that entry point is hard.
So this is the thing that I believe is the most difficult concept for people to sort of wrap their minds around. Because a lot of people think of a training cycle from the very end outcome, which is what happens on the day of the meet.
Yep.
I'm totaling I'm totaling 210. I want to total 220. Like, then they see it as like, what numbers do I need to do and hit to get there? I got to do a double here or a triple there or this or that, right? And they kind of create arbitrary landmarks to get to that point. Yeah. What I would look at is what adaptations are going to be what's the primary adaptation I need to achieve in the next block of training, and how many of those blocks am I going to string together in a phase, this early phase, to achieve that. So if we know that, okay, I'm going to have a hypertrophy block dedicated to the thigh muscles, right, or to my legs. So primarily it's going to be squatting and some other leg accessory movements. Mm-hmm. What is the time frame within this general phase that I have to accomplish that.
It's how can we optimize for that within the constraints of the program?
Then we optimize towards that end, which is to say we want big ass fucking legs at the end of this block, at the end of this phase.
Yeah.
What are the mechanistic things we have to change and manipulate to get there? Then the monitoring of that. How do we monitor whether I've gotten there or not?
Yeah. We're not getting there on Weight Watchers.
Right.
By the way, just in case people wondered.
So let's take something even a little more easy to identify, like work capacity. If somebody is out of shape, we need to say what is the ability, like how much work does someone need to tolerate and recover from at a given degree of internal stress from where they're at now to 6 weeks from now.
Yeah.
I want to start a special prep block that is going to start with this much load, right?
Yeah.
And we want to be able to tolerate 9 workouts a week or 7 workouts a week that are all going to be 400 reps a month or 400 reps a week or whatever it is. How do we get to that point where we're able to tolerate that? Okay,
because there are benefits to being able to do more work.
We know that is where they've been in the past. We know that's what they need to do going forward to make progress. So how do we get there with work capacity? Well, we have to. What is the end? We need this at the end, like a meaningful increase in our ability to tolerate work. Ability to recover. Where are we at right now? Okay, those are the 2 points that are far apart. How are we going to structure blocks leading into that? And it's largely just everything goes from a decision that is big picture. From the phasic level to the next level, which is block level, to the next level, which is what are the mechanistic things we manipulate. When we manipulate them, how does the athlete respond? Well, we know that work capacity is largely going to be influenced by an increase in extensive means. So increases in total volume or, maybe, increases in density. So we do the same amount of work in less time. We may move both of those mechanisms together, right? We may add volume and decrease time, or we may decrease time, then the next week add volume. Whatever way we approach it isn't as relevant as knowing what the mechanisms are that are going to drive that result and then manipulating them in a way that is going to get us there. We also have to track this from week to week saying, okay, we apply a stress to an athlete. The next week, what is our predicted increase in performance? How much have they adapted to and how much have they grown? Then we make an adjustment. If we exceeded that adaptation or didn't reach that adaptation, what's the typical response, and then make adjustments from there. Right. This sounds more complex than it is. If you think about it, a very basic example is like, we're going to increase the squat, basic strength in the squat. We're going to do a top set of 5 week 1 at RPE 7 and then back offs, 15% off of that. Athlete does that the first week. The second week you come in, you have an understanding, hey, we're going to go to RPE 8. My predicted range for this athlete for RPE 8, top set of 5 is, maybe week 1 they did 100. This week, maybe 107. That's what I expect them to be at. If they grind out on their warm-ups 95 kilos, oh shit, okay. That first week, we need to make an adjustment to what we expect them to tolerate or to respond to. If they come in and they fucking smash 107 and it's an RPE 6, okay, wow, they responded greater. Next week, we might take a bigger jump, right? We make an adjustment to that. Same thing happens. We have to know what our mechanisms are that we're manipulating, and we have to know what the expected outcome of that manipulation is. Adaptations happen, then we add overload to the program, we try to get more adaptations, and we just continue this process, right? Knowing what the mechanisms are is what's critical. And then knowing the way to apply them to athletes is also critical. So we can monitor what's happening.
So we obviously can't get volumes because we can't say for people listening, do this number of reps. Or if you're programming for someone, start with this number of reps. I mean, you can't do that because everyone's measurement tool is different.
Well, it's also that someone's ability to execute training and to create an adaptation from that could change. Right. And it could change from many factors. One, it could change from external stress that's non-specific. So you just got a shitty job or your wife broke up.
You work with Max Ada.
You're really tired all the time. It could be any number of things that has an impact on that at any point in time. Right.
Because stress is stress.
Right. And some's non-specific so that it's not actually driving results. The other factors are that you could modify the mechanisms by which you're training in a way that is more difficult or less difficult.
Yep.
If you increase the intensity of your general prep phase, or you increase the intensity of your work capacity training, that's going to have an impact on the total number of reps you can do. So something like total volume and intensity and all these metrics that we use are really a shadow of a bigger thing, which is stress. Like
internal load.
Yeah. How much load can we apply to the athlete?
Yeah.
Where is the load centered as far as like, where is it going to drive adaptation?
And what's the throughput?
Right. If you have a certain load and it is concentrated at really high intensities, very specific exercise selection, and very low volume, you're going to get a certain adaptation from that. If you take that load and expand it and push the intensity down, it has a different adaptation, right? The response is different. So these things are shadows of training load. Training load is something that's just amorphous, and it moves. We move it to what we want from an adaptation standpoint.
Well, it's all of it's arbitrary too, because we talked about in the previous episode, we talked about hypertrophy, and we talked about having a minimum threshold for intensity. Right. Because if there wasn't a minimum threshold, you would go for a walk and you'd get bigger. Yeah. I mean, by definition, theoretically, muscular contractions over time, resisting the force of gravity.
There's probably somebody who has.
Because they're undertrained.
Who was bedridden. Maybe they got out of bed and they walked and they got fucking jacked.
This music played in the background. They were celebrating. And so there's a minimum threshold. You have to do a certain amount of work at a certain intensity. So there are like boundaries around all this. The one thing I'd be wondering for you, and one of the questions I had, is knowing that volumes are just really hard to decide or determine or even assign. It's kind of like a guess and check your work type thing. It's like, I was really far off, or hey, I was spot on. What about exercises? And I think that's a little more specific, and I think we can help people get closer to the target of the right exercises in a general block of training.
So like early in general phases, right? The way I would look at exercise selection is we're going to try to do a couple of things. We have to identify, one, what are the exercises that we want to remain in the program because they have a beneficial influence on the technique when they're present. Yeah. So, the transfer of training is something that exists because the exercise is present. Yeah. So let's say you have somebody who, gets behind the bar really early. Yeah. Something like hang snatches might be a great option for them because
which position?
From like below the knee, right? It puts them in a position where their low back is going to be, held in position where they want it. Yeah. They can push with their legs better. It just does a little bit better job of putting them in the place you want them. Yeah. Right. So we want to have it present in the program. We don't necessarily need it to be something that is transferring to the skill of a snatch. We just need it because we know that incorporating in the program facilitates a faster transition to more specific work. So we would do, hang snatches purely on their own because there's no need to complex them in the way that we want the skill transferring. Then we would look at exercises that are going to have an influence on, maybe remediating a technical error or improving some kind of aspect of the technique. Let's say you don't necessarily have an error in the jerk, but your drive is weak. So we would incorporate more exercises that are going to influence that, maybe push presses or power jerks, right? Or jerk drives or whatever it is that we're going to pausing, anything that's going to augment that improvement in the drive. That's something that's like we're starting to build on that motor quality, technical skill, whatever it is. So we have movements that remain in the program because they are technically sort of keystones for us. Yeah. They preserve elements of the technique that would degrade if they weren't present. Then we have exercises that are done as a way to augment a skill or a component of the lift that is weak that we're trying to develop. So things like for the jerk drive. And then the final piece would be any kind of movements that are going to the bare minimum amount of highly specific movements that we need only to preserve the technique or prevent degradation of it as much as possible. So maybe that's classic snatch. Yeah. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's more challenging exercises that are, no hook, no feed or no contact because it allows us to stay in touch with the skill of the technique, the classic lift,
Right.
without having to spend a lot of time on it. Because if we already have technical errors, like we've talked about this before, if you have technical errors and we're incorporating lots of snatching, we're probably going to ingrain those technical errors more.
Or why use exercises that either solidify errors or neglect the remediation of those errors.
Right.
So it's like if you get behind the bar a lot, why would you do snatches from the hip? I mean, it's just like that doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, because it's the kind of thing that's like the probability of you exaggerating the technique error that you have could be greater with some exercises.
Yeah.
A good example of this is if you have a hard time getting under the bar and you have a lot of power variations in your program, you're spending a lot of time doing the thing you don't want to do, right?
Or if you don't have a problem supporting the weight overhead, your position off the floor is really bad, but you're doing snatch balance. It's just like that.
Yeah.
You can understand the logic, but it just falls short of actually having a big impact or effect.
And the reason why it's critical to understand this is not because I believe that there's a lot of thinking that is very rudimentary in that 1 + 1 = 2. If I do this exercise, it fixes this problem. What do power snatches do? Oh, they make you do this. Well, they have an influence on that. They have an influence on
likely to do something when you power snatch.
If you do power snatches, you're more likely to lengthen certain phases of the pull because you're only moving in one direction.
You can still cut a power snatch short.
Sure.
You can still jump out of position.
Right.
You can lift the lift. You can make it as badly as
you can do anything wrong.
You can do anything wrong.
Very true. Right. But the reason why it's critical to have a great grasp on exercise influence, what it has from a technical influence on somebody's lifting, what it does to somebody's, ability to display certain qualities of a movement is important because we want to maximize training all the time. We want to do the most possible good training we can. So if we're doing less training than we could be doing and we're just throwing more exercises in there that aren't helping, we're just wasting energy and time.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of that would be a good example would be in a general phase. You want to build size in the shoulders or pressing strength. And you do partial presses. Yeah. And it's like, well, maybe you can reserve that for a more specific block where you need to overload a certain part of the lift because you just happen to really, really slow at that point. Or you just want to minimize fatigue at some point. You have some reason. But in a general block, it's going to be fuller ranges and more rudimentary exercises. Not rudimentary instead of a barbell press, I'm going to do a cable press because I can get in a lower position.
Sure.
But it's finding the unicorn exercise that happens to check the box of specificity, position, the phases of the movement, muscular contraction type, and then the amount of tension you can put through, the fatigue that's generated, right? You're trying to capture all these into the exercises, the structure of the workouts, structure of the weeks, training block.
Yeah, exactly. And so, general training phases should be such that you have selected movements, which we just talked about, that satisfy a few criteria. We want to preserve technical faults that we know will degrade if we don't. That's key. It's common sense. We want to eliminate movements that potentially could exaggerate.
Right.
I mean, we shouldn't even do them anyways, but it's possible that there's a trade-off there, right?
Pressing out weights and then you're doing, a lot of power snatches.
Right. If you press out jerks, push presses may still be an okay exercise for you, but it's not the kind of thing we want to do early in the cycle, because it's not something that's actually benefiting us right now. We don't need to worry about that now. And then, choose means, like you said, that would allow us to augment the training of the general qualities.
Yeah.
So something like a cable press is a great example of something that would augment the ability to, facilitate some of the training for hypertrophy in the shoulders versus a barbell press.
Yeah.
Because, you can get a little more range of motion.
Yeah.
And that's going to be better suited to hypertrophy training than a barbell press, right? Dumbbells versus a barbell, right?
Sure, yeah.
To a degree. Obviously, there's always trade-offs, but we would select movements in that way.
Yeah.
We also then, understand now our collection of exercises we choose early on is something that can be sequenced as well. Right. We don't go from doing, seated hamstring curls to RDLs. Maybe not the best sort of sequencing. So we can't really, it's not the best example. We can't really take something that's really different and then translate that into something else. If you do a bunch of curls and get your biceps fucking huge in the general phase, that's awesome. But what is the sequence of how is that translating to the next phase of training to transfer into snatch and clean and jerk?
I mean, the last thing I'll say is, and I think to your point, you condition yourself to tolerate training. If you condition a very specific muscle to tolerate training, and then you take a big exercise like an RDL and implement that in the place of a smaller exercise, maybe you didn't condition your low back as much, or you didn't condition the position as much with the load. Like good morning is a great example. If you expect to go from hamstring curl to heavy good mornings, that's going to be a rude awakening. So you want to build capacity to tolerate future training. That's a great, that's done really well through general blocks.
And to sort of round it out, I guess that wrap it up is that general phases of training, just like any other phase of training, should have the same significant weight applied to them in the planning process, right? We sit down, we look at what do we need to accomplish, how are we going to accomplish that, what are we monitoring to make sure that we're actually applying the stress, the load in a way that's moving us closer to our goal. Then we plan this in a way that it's going to translate into the next phase of training. We're not going to go from boom, this crazy block of really somewhat non-specific movements and all these things to now this totally radically different training program that is now very different, right? We don't do tens in the squat and move to Bulgarian. So I think that sums up sort of a broad overview of general training phase.
I thought it was great.
Cool. If you're interested, go check out the Coachlogik mentorship group. We're going to talk more about this in the group, and we're going to have a great time. We have tons of great guests. We will see you guys there.